The ocean is a mysterious place. It never stops moving or changing or drawing us in. For as long as humans have been around this planet, we've been pulled to those waves like a siren song, and no distance has been close enough. For thousands of years, sailors have braved those dangerous waters in search of the new lands, new creatures, and new civilizations. And it's almost a primal urge to go and see, to discover, to learn. And as we've done that, we've improved our methods. One of the biggest reasons for that was safety. Along with being mysterious, the ocean is also deadly, which made it important for those vessels to keep the lives on board safe from harm. And for the most part, it worked. But you can't read much about the history of sailing vessels before encountering a frightening truth. Not all ships survived their journey. And while, yes, advances in technology have lessened those losses over time, the pages of history are littered with examples of promising voyages that failed to deliver. You see, for as long as there have been ships, there have been the ghosts of the ones who failed, specters of the sea that arrive when we least expect it, folks who believe that they arrive to foretell impending doom, while others see them as an echo of dark tragedy. Most, though, serve to remind us of what once was and what was lost. And at the core of all of those stories is a more frightening truth, one that few people care to wrestle with. Most things that are lost are gone forever. But when it comes to the sea, some ships refuse to go quietly. I'm Aaron Mahnke, and this is Lore Legends. The 1600s saw Puritans travel from England to what is now America for some much-needed religious freedom. The most famous of these journeys involved the arrival of the ship the Mayflower, which landed at Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620. 18 years later, however, a separate group of Puritans came and established the colony of New Haven throughout New England. And the New Haven colony was founded by Minister John Davenport, who had left England for Holland to escape religious persecution from the crown. And then he fled from there to Boston, before eventually founding New Haven. It wasn't clear what compelled Davenport to found his new colony instead of joining one of the already established settlements. Perhaps he'd been part of certain religious disagreements in Boston, or he might have believed it was easier to prosper in a new location rather than compete with Boston merchants. There was also the matter of the Antinomian controversy, also known as the Free Grace controversy. It was a conflict within the Massachusetts Bay Colony that had started in 1636, and it continued until 1638. Antinomians believed that Christians didn't have to obey Mosaic law like the Ten Commandments. They had the Holy Spirit on their side, which contradicted the beliefs of most of the others in the colony. So Davenport set out to start his own settlement called New Haven along the Connecticut River. He and his fellow colonists dug cellar-like homes into the hillside, with a plan to trade various goods, such as furs, with Boston and Manhattan, then known as New Amsterdam. Those goods would then make their way back to England, and new supplies would be sent back to America. A minister by the name of William Hooke joined Davenport's new colony in 1644. He was a firm believer in fasting and prayer, which he believed would not only bring them closer to God, but would practically guarantee their success. He was so confident in his beliefs that he was quoted as saying, "Fasting and prayer are murderers that will kill point blank from one end of the world to the other. Thousands shall fall and never know who hurt them." Meaning, nobody should stand in the way of a colony as devout as his. Unfortunately, no amount of fasting or praying could help them get their trade routes off the ground. New Haven started to lose money, and the colonists were getting desperate. The merchants decided that a great ship should be built to take goods to England directly, bypassing Massachusetts Bay and providing New Haven with the means to get their much-needed supplies. And so a ship was commissioned. It was to be built in Rhode Island and to measure 80 feet long, weighing somewhere between 100 and 150 tons. Tied to its masts were massive sails to catch the wind and propel the colony toward victory. But large sails weren't what made ships good. Good shipbuilders were, and the great ship didn't exactly live up to its namesake. According to its captain, George Lambert, it was a cranky vessel, prone to capsizing if the right wave hit it. It didn't help that the bottom of the ship had been loaded with light items, while the heavier goods had been stored up top. The unbalanced weight made the ship difficult to control. It bobbed in the water like a cork. However, despite its shortcomings, it had no choice but to get the job done for the sake of the colony. The vessel was loaded up with furs, lumber, peas, wheat, along with copies of Davenport's sermons. He wanted them printed back in England, of course. The great ship was launched from New Haven Colony in January of 1646 to much fanfare, once the 3-mile-long ice blockage was cleared out of the harbor, that is. And once free, the ship was towed backward into Long Island Sound, which the sailors viewed as an ill omen of what was to come. Along with the various goods for trade, the great ship carried 70 passengers and crew on board who were responsible for keeping her upright and pointed toward England. And once they had cleared the initial hurdles getting out of the harbor, it seemed like things were looking up. Davenport, however, watched as the ship disappeared into the smothering sea fog, with worry displayed across his furrowed brow. He had been heard uttering the following prayer: "Lord, if it be thy pleasure to bury these our friends in the bottom of the sea, they are thine. Save them." Months passed with no word from the great ship. It had been expected that any trip back to England would have taken about 2 months to complete, but so much time had already passed, and the remaining New Haven colonists were getting worried. But they didn't have much time to dwell on the what-ifs surrounding the vessel. In June of 1647, a massive thunderstorm struck the New Haven colony. It cleared out by early evening, and in its wake left a beautiful, clear view of the New Haven harbor. The sun's descent behind the horizon wouldn't begin for another hour, and as residents ventured outside to assess the damage, they looked out into the distance. And there it was. Some said it came down from the sky, a detail wielded by UFO enthusiasts today as proof that aliens have been coming to Earth for centuries. Others from the colony claimed to have seen Captain Lambert on deck with his sword pointed straight ahead. However, the closer the ship got to home port, the clearer it became that it was in bad shape. The Reverend James Pierpont chronicled its return half a century later, in which he wrote, "Her main top seemed to be blown off, but left hanging in the shrouds, then her mizzen top, then all her masting seemed blown away by the board." Spectators on the shore were shocked and horrified to see what they believed to be the great ship in ruins, and as the crowd watched, the vessel careened to one side and tipped over. It disappeared in a cloud of smoke. When the haze finally cleared, the great ship was gone, never to be seen again. Its crew and passengers were lost, and to this day, no trace of the wreck has ever been found. John Davenport believed the ship that he'd seen that day was a vision sent by God as an answer to the prayers that they were asking for what happened to the great ship. It may also have been a sign of what was eventually to befall New Haven. The staggering loss of life and property sent the colony spiraling, and by 1662, it had dissolved entirely. Over the years, the apparition of the great ship has been immortalized in art and verse by many writers and poets, including in a poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow called The Phantom Ship. And every once in a while, it can still be seen, bounding toward the harbor where New Haven once stood, trying its best to deliver those supplies. About 1,000 miles north of New Haven resides Chaleur Bay, which sits within a lobster claw-like piece of land that separates the Canadian provinces of New Brunswick and Quebec. The bay is a hotbed of fishing activity, but only for the bravest fishermen in Canada. The tall cliffs along its shores tend to draw in harsh weather and winds that whip against ships like angry spirits. In fact, for centuries there have been sightings of a ghostly ship that haunts the bay, its 3 masts and hull being devoured by hungry flames. Its origins are as vague and shadowy as the briny depth, but several stories have persisted over the centuries. One holds that 2 Portuguese explorers named Gaspar and Miguel Correal had kidnapped a group of native peoples back in the year 1501. The captives were then sold into slavery, but their relatives never forgot. When Gaspar returned the following year, the mothers, fathers, siblings, aunts, and uncles of those who had been taken were waiting. They chained him to a rock in the bay at low tide and watched as the water slowly overtook his body, drowning him as they enjoyed a picnic nearby. Miguel eventually came looking for his brother, but found only his ship. He climbed aboard to have a look around, unaware that he had company waiting for him. Without warning, the native people ambushed him. Miguel tried to escape and, in the process, set the ship aflame. As the fire consumed the vessel, Miguel used his final words to curse the people of the Bay of Chaleur, vowing to haunt them for 1,000 years. The brothers were never heard from again, and a rescue effort conducted the following year by their other brother, Vasco Inez, proved unsuccessful. However, one of their ships did return to Portugal, with 50 captured members of the Bothak tribe. Some claim that the inscription on Massachusetts' Dighton Rock proves that Miguel and his men sailed the New England coastline for many years, rendered lost by dense fog and a lack of knowledge of the area. Others believe that the flaming ship is the one that took part in the 1760 Battle of the Restigouche. This was a 17-day naval conflict between the French and British forces that took place during the 7 Years' War. It was a fierce battle in which the French were forced to scuttle many of their own ships. In fact, it was believed by some that the fire ship was actually a French ship. However, that vessel was never burned. After it sunk, its hull was raised and preserved at a local monastery. As a result of this battle, the French were eventually forced to surrender several months later. Still, there are those who claim the fire ship of Chaleur Bay is actually the specter of the English vessel, the Colburn, which met its end in 1838. It had run aground while carrying a massive haul of gold. It was October, and the Colburn had been well off course for some time, with 55 crew and passengers on board. Only 12 survived the wreck. One of those survivors, Joseph Jones Atkinson, said, "Half an hour after the ship first struck, she went on the rocks again, this time falling on her side, throwing passengers and crew into the sea." The Colburn drifted for days until it was finally to shore, where many bodies were found amongst the wreckage. Cargo from the ship, as well as additional victims, floated their way to land over the following days and weeks. The fishing families who lived in the area became rich after discovering gold from the Colburn that had washed ashore. And yet another possible origin for the flaming ship is that of the notorious pirate, Captain Craig. Craig primarily appears in stories about the vessel, which may be a twist on the local legend that it had actually been a three-masted sailing ship called the John Craig. It was said to have sunk off Shippagan Island around 1800. The only survivor of the wreck had been a cabin boy who swam to shore before passing away from exhaustion. Among the tales surrounding Captain Craig's ghostly transport is one version in which a woman from the Mi'kmaq tribe was kidnapped and killed by the pirate. With her dying breath, she choked out the words, "For as long as the world is, may you burn on the bay." In a more gruesome variation on that story, the woman was instead a virgin bride who was taken and assaulted by the crew. They soon discovered that their ship was set ablaze with no escape. Their souls and their ship were then cursed to sail along Chaleur Bay for eternity. And another legend claimed that a crewman on a ship facing bad weather in the bay knelt to pray the rosary. He was murdered by his fellow sailors who believed such an action would bring bad luck. Instead, the only bad luck they found was their vessel being destroyed by a fire that was said to have been the Catholic crewman's revenge. Of course, there is never a shortage of skeptics to throw water on the idea of a burning ghost ship. The fire ship's existence has been described as a fata morgana, or attributed to phosphorescent marine life in the water. Those who have seen it, though, believe it defies scientific explanation. Its presence can mean anything from an omen of bad luck to the impending arrival of a storm. A witness named Peter Flott told a reporter in 1951, "Usually it's a sailing vessel wrapped in flames. It has also been a shapeless ball of fire, a ship's lantern, and once in 1906, it was a burning steamer." The fire ship typically only appears at night, and if it's not sailing in the water itself, it's hovering several feet above the bay. Its phantom crew is sometimes spotted on the decks or shimmying across the rigging, their pained screams echoing out over the water as the flames swallow the hull and masts. And sometimes the crew isn't there at all, just the once great ship burning endlessly, despite being surrounded by nothing but water. The eastern coast of North America isn't home to just one flaming ship. Another has haunted the waters off the coast of Rhode Island since 1738. It was called the Princess Augusta, a majestic name for an aging 200-ton, three-masted British vessel. It had been built for both passengers and cargo, and it was captained by a man named George Long. On December 27th, Captain Long was in the midst of his duties, steering his 14-man crew and several hundred German immigrants toward Philadelphia. It was likely that the Germans, who hailed from the Palatinate region, intended to join a Pennsylvania Dutch community in America with members from the same area. The arduous journey took months and was plagued by difficulties. Between the heavy storms and the dysentery, half the crew and at least 240 passengers died. It's possible that Captain Long also succumbed to the disease while at sea. However, the details of the story vary depending on where the person telling it comes from. Those who live on Block Island claim that Captain Long didn't die from dysentery. He was in fact murdered by the crew so they could hold the passengers hostage. The scoundrels withheld food and water until the German passengers coughed up their money and belongings. Once the frightened immigrants had given up all they had, the crew abandoned the ship. It floated on until it finally ran aground at Sandy Point, a 1.5-mile-long sandbar off Block Island, known for causing lots of shipwrecks. The islanders took the Germans in and helped them recover, setting the wreckage on fire to prevent it from being drawn back out to sea and becoming a problem for other passing ships. Sadly, one wealthy Dutch woman did not make it out alive. Her name was Mary Vanderline, and her anxiety caused by the mutiny had caused her to seek refuge in the cargo hold. She was unable to free herself after the Augusta was set ablaze, and she perished in the fire. Some say the story that the mainlanders tell is much different and even more tragic. The people on the island apparently lit their own signal fire. Some say it was just a lantern hanging off the neck of an old mule, but others say it was actual timber. And when the ship's crew spotted it and approached, the island folk killed and robbed them. And the Princess Augusta was then lit on fire to hide the evidence. Now, in this version, a female passenger struggling in the water reached for the islanders' boat only to have her arm sliced off by the salvagers. It wasn't uncommon for Block Island residents to make their money by wrecking or salvaging items from shipwrecks off their shores. However, those on the mainland misunderstood the practice as the islanders causing the shipwrecks in order to rob the people on board. Evidence points the truth closer to the islanders' tale of murder and kidnapping by the crew, but some contemporary accounts claim that on December 29th, a strong storm ripped the ship apart and caused it to sink. Whatever the case, it is generally agreed that in December of 1738, the Princess Augusta ran aground off the coast of Block Island. Many of the 60 surviving passengers made their way to Philadelphia, where they settled into the colony as planned. About 30, though, did not survive. They were believed to have perished shortly after reaching Block Island. And 2 women, known only as Short Kate and Long Kate, remained on the island. Short Kate became a domestic servant and lived a fairly uneventful life following her ordeal on the Augusta, but not Long Kate. She married an enslaved man named Newport and became a fortune teller to make ends meet. She had a litany of paranormal skills and was no stranger to having visions or out-of-body experiences. Long Kate often spoke about flying back to her homeland for quick visits, which entailed entering a trance-like state behind a wall or under a bush. It took a lot out of her, and it scared the islanders, who viewed her as a witch. 1 year after Short and Long Kate had come to the island, a merchant vessel was spotted sailing through Block Island Sound. According to its crew, they caught sight of a giant ship on fire. The men sailed closer, perhaps to get a closer look, or maybe to save anyone who was still on board. But as the crew drew near, the Augusta vanished. There was nothing on the surface of the water. Not a single body, living or otherwise. There were no charred beams or planks from the ship either. And since the burning vessel had been seen on the 1-year anniversary of the wreck, it was referred to henceforth as the Palatine Light, named for the Palatinate region its German passengers had originally come from. The Palatine Light had been seen countless times ever since. In a letter to the Newport Mercury from 1878, a witness named Benjamin Congdon wrote about having seen it at least 8 to 10 times, if not more, in his life. He wrote, "Nobody doubted her being sent by an almighty power to punish those wicked men who murdered her passengers and crew. After the last of these were dead, she was never more seen." But that wasn't entirely true. Sightings of the Princess Augusta up in flames continued well past the death of the final islander responsible. It appeared as someone in 1963. The Coast Guard and Navy were sent in to investigate a burning ship in the Sound, but nothing was ever found there. Some accounts say that you can still hear the screams of Mary van der Laan, the passenger who is said to have died in the ship's hold. And islanders even got in on the booming spiritualism movement in the late 1800s to hold seances, attempting to reach out to the ship's spirit. But perhaps the greatest testament to its existence happened on February 9th of 1880, when over 50 people claimed to have seen it all in one evening. One of those witnesses happened to be future U.S. Senator Nathan F. Dixon III. A woman known only as Mrs. Rose told the New York Times about her experience that night several years later. She had seen the Princess Augusta through her window, pushing ahead, its sails plump with wind. And it was on fire, from the water's edge to her highest sail, she said. And yet, despite the ship being engulfed in flames, it sailed onward as if it was unaware of its condition. It disappeared 15 minutes later and left Mrs. Rose overcome with a sense of foreboding. She knew that something bad was on the horizon. 4 days later, a group of Block Island residents died in Newport Harbor. They had been descendants of the islanders who had caused the Augusta's wreckage all those years before. While the Princess Augusta was known for the precious cargo being carried to America, there was other cargo on board as well. One of the loads being hauled was lignum vitae, a hardwood from the West Indies. It was known for its strength and density, which made it extremely valuable as shipbuilding material. Much of the lignum vitae had survived the wreck and was repurposed by the people of Block Island into mortars for grinding corn. They had been grinding it by hand for years after Mark Dodge, a local eccentric and opium eater, as he's recorded, had burned down the only mill on the island, killing himself in the process. Now, one of those mortars, measuring 14 inches high and almost a foot in diameter, wound up in the home of one Simon Ray. Ray had opened his home to many of the shipwreck survivors and had allowed a number of the victims to be buried on his land. The mortar remained in the house even after the Ray family had moved away. The new homeowners kept the lignum vitae mortar after moving in, but quickly noticed that there was something off about it. For one, it liked dance. It would move up and down as if pulled by a puppeteer in the ceiling, but with no strings attached. Other times, it would jump off a shelf and flop around the room like a freshly caught trout gasping for air. It would then tip itself upright and rock back and forth before jumping up and down from the floor all the way to the top of the ceiling again. After it was finished, the mortar would be returned to its shelf, where it stayed without incident for months at a time. And unsurprisingly, after the dancing mortar's performance, it was said that the ghost ship would make an appearance in the Sound as well. What caused such a lively demonstration from a seemingly mundane plank of wood? According to 19th century chronicler Samuel Livermore, it was none other than the spirit of that dead opium addict, the one who had burned down the mill, Mark Dodge. And whether or not the story is true, it certainly illustrates the power that the wreck of the Princess Augusta has had over the people of Block Island, and how even if the vessel is no longer visible, it has never stopped doing what ghost ships are said to do best: haunting the open water and reminding those on land of everything they've lost. Sailing the high seas is something that humans have been very good at for a very long time, and for almost as long, those voyages have been accompanied by stories full of tragedy and shadow, and naturally, we've only scratched the surface of tales to tell, which is why I've set aside one last tale of ghostly vessels to share with you. Stick around through this brief sponsor break to hear all about it. Almost 20 years after the Princess Augusta was lost, the New York Gazette published an unusual letter. A group of fishermen had asserted that on February 4th of 1754, they had seen a shocking apparition in nearby Gardiner's Bay, but it wasn't a ghost ship. It was several. The letter described a trio of ships full-rigged with their sails unfurled. The men had seen smoke coming from the guns on all the ships, but hadn't heard the sound of muskets or cannon fire. The letter goes on. During their engagement, they put about several times, and the large ship hauled up her courses. The whole was performed with the utmost dexterity, as though they were navigated by most skillful mariners. After 15 minutes, the ship disappeared, and the water returned to normal. Now, some speculated that this was, in fact, a ghostly pirate battle related to the notorious Captain Kidd, who had buried treasure on nearby islands, according to legend. It might also have been connected to another ghost ship that was said to have been beset by pirates in the area. In the mid-1600s, a merchant vessel carrying furs and lumber had been overtaken by pirates there, but there was something else on board, a beautiful and valuable white stallion. The pirates tied the crew and the horse to the mast before lighting the ship on fire and then fleeing back to their own. The flaming vessel continued to follow the pirates as it burned, its crew and the lone horse wailing in agony. Over the years, the inflamed ship has been seen in the Long Island Sound. Some say the crew is still searching for the pirates responsible. Others have seen the men on board going about their duties, accompanied by passengers engaged in some form of gambling as the fire consumes the decks. But despite the flames that rage and climb its masts, the ship makes no sound, save for the neighing of the white stallion, crying out into the night. As always, folks, thanks so much for watching. Credits for today's episode are in the description below. Lore has been a podcast since 2015, with over 415 million downloads to date. You can learn more about this show, plus the book series and the television adaptation over at lorepodcast.com. And of course, be sure to click on the subscribe button and the bell icon so that you never miss a future episode. And if you enjoyed this episode, click that thumbs up. And you can also follow the show on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Just search for Lore Podcast, all one word, and then click that follow button. And when you do, say hi. I like it when people say hi. And as always, thanks for watching.